So welcome to this specific think tank session. So we got a lot of chance to that. We got a very interesting panel. People who will teach us a lot of, will bring us their experience as researchers, as professionals in the world of think tanks, and at the same time, set a panel that will help us progress and think. A panel with 500 persons, and they will have first a short introduction for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we will start or kick off a dialogue with the audience, and we'll be happy to answer your questions to go deeper into the topic. The theme of this session is over a superpower or coalition of medium-sized powers. Here we got the Chinese bloc, the US bloc, and it was mentioned that we feel some kind Europe has been has lost its might. Other countries have to obey the boss, and what is the space for something else? Power in the 21st century. So we need, the BRICS are trying to, find to be another group bloc. So this panel is going to enlighten us here. First speaker will be Alexander Medvedovsky, who is the president of the from Remington. Then they will hear Shekhar Aikar, who will speak English, but there will be interpretation into French, who is the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. And we're very honored and happy to have you with us, sir. Then Douglas Redeker, who will also speak English, from the Brookings Institution. He's a senior researcher in the Brookings Institution, and they will talk about geoeconomics. And then we'll have with us Maria Elena Aguero, Secretary General of the Club de Madrid. And finally, last but not least, Charles Lickfield, from the Director of Prospective and Economic Analysis at the Atlantic Council. So just allow me to say a couple of introductory words. What is the coherence between the various speakers? Well, in fact, there is a significant coherence from the various contributions we'll hear. I don't know how you see the world, but as an economist, I was absolutely convinced by I'm a European, so I've been educated with Montesquieu, soft trade. When you trade, you don't go to war. So the period of enlightenment in the global world, where we trade and where we have families with 2 kids with democratic values. So I was this kind of universal idea, which is very Europe-centric. The world, vision of the world. And I have to say, and in the European construction, this is, we were at war with each other for centuries. Let's have a single market, war is over. That was the idea. Then Angela Merkel did a pipe between Russia and Germany to transport gas, and then we got the war in Ukraine. You can trade and go to war anyway. That was a shock for me, actually. And I think, this is a different vision of the world, and disregard from the disregard of the former colonial power to the rest of the world. Alexander will have a different vision and talk about where we come from since the end of Second World War and the evolutions we experienced. And Shekhar will help us to step back, have a higher vision, because the countries that go to war still, international trade has increased in the last year. Trade is very much like water. Always find a way to see through, and Shekhar will explain his theory, will enlighten us, because there are countries who are actually connectors, interfaces, and this could be a role to more modest countries. Douglas will give us his views on obstacles to the advent of middle powers, and there are obstacles, and then we want to hear him. We're very eager to see what he can propose versus the China-US hegemony. And Maria has a great experience. He will tell us how to go beyond obstacles, the advent of true middle powers, and especially through coalitions. She embodies this concept. And finally, Charles will discuss the failure of the G2, China, US, and we don't want to be, we don't want to yield. So let's see what the evolution. So great coherence for people who've never met, actually, because the ideas that underlie their work, are not that numerous. So with no further ado, Alexander. Thank you. Hello, and good afternoon to the other members of the panel. I'm not a member of a think tank. I'm not a researcher. I'm a business manager. I'm a company manager. I'm a European, so a double cap, manager and European. That I will say a couple of words of introduction, trying not to be too long and to respect the 4 minutes given to me. So first, let me say that power struggles are more between powers, superpower or middle powers. It's good to have this discussion. It's no longer something that is left to the diplomats, the experts, to the geographers or the historians. It can be seen in the business of companies, in their supply chain, in their financing process, in their technology, and even in their board of directors. So this is a topic that is of interest to businesses, which means for me that this roundtable is a very concrete, very highly operational topic, not intellectual at all. And what we want to know if middle powers we belong to are still able to organize themselves sufficiently in order not to have to yield to the choices of the US or China. Well, I would say 4 things to try to open the discussion. First point, I do believe that we are in a major change versus what we have known since the end of World War II. Following the 2 world wars in the European nations to which we belong, we're able to go from the state of imperial and war-mongering nations to that of Pacific democratic nation that would cooperate and will for more integration at every level, and this is the birth of the European Union until the first circle, the Eurozone, and this for a long time, European countries the status as the medium or middle power. A country like France. Collectively, we've learned throughout the years to be happy with this status, coming out to history, convinced that the US military umbrella would protect us all the time. Until the Brexit 2016, 10 years, and the first election of Trump, November 2016, the war started by Russia, Ukraine, February 2022. The European Union, have a feeling. So we have a true coalition of medium-sized powers, middle powers. There are multilateral institutions in the world. Very much like the application of the law, international law. So this is what we've seen in the last decade, the collapse, actually, the intellectual and operational framework of the post-Second World War has been erased to the benefit of conflictual rising of the US and of China. And this competition we experience today, 2 superpower is seen in all powers, financial, economic, technological, standards, everything. So for business as we are, this is of course a huge challenge. We have to deal and to have to learn new rules, explicit, implicit rules, new game, more aggressive, more competitive, sometimes without any rules and with a deep challenging of our basis. This could damage our industries. We see it with the European automotive industry. Second point, superpower are the winners of a happy globalization. I'll spare you the cliches, but we can see clearly, I don't know what my colleagues think, but the period we experience is super domination of the 2 superpowers, that is China and the US. And if we are not cautious enough, and if we cannot react in Europe, this will last quite a long time. And this applies through to the technological domination, their capacity to impose rules like extraterritoriality, and then the way they can massively finance their growth and investment. as the Prime Minister from Canada said in Davos, middle democratic powers have to review their national doctrine and alliance doctrine, and he asked for, for the alliance of middle powers. So, anyway, a lot of things are to be met to make this credible, especially in Europe, where we can see, even though there is the opinion, we cannot say that this alliance of middle power is sufficient to be present in this competition and this rivalry between the two superpowers. Third point in my introduction is that the struggle starts in our head, in our minds. That is, we are not going to lead our populations to dream. We come up with a slogan that we need, middle size or middle powers. Great people, you want to sit around the table, and we have an alliance of medium powers. It's not concrete, it's not sexy, and though we have to go beyond the framework of that discussion to go further. And as you said earlier on, and I fully agree with you, I think that more than ever, what is at stake is that of defense, the promotion and actualization of the European model. Our societies are highly resilient because they're democratic, because they are educated, they're protected, and they carry humanistic values, which is their basis. This is what is being challenged today, threatened. And now we businesses, sometimes we feel we are the last wall, of the to preserve this European way of life. Everywhere there are populist programs in Europe and elsewhere. They attack industries, academics, knowledge, innovation. These damage and challenge the perennity and viability of the European project. This is the major challenge, and I don't know if we'll discuss that, but I think what's so special about France is when we see the coexistence of a very high extreme right and extreme left. This is, in my opinion, these are threats. For the equilibrium of the entire European continent. I think the next presidential election in France is essential versus what's going on all over Europe. We need banks, we need insurance companies, we need investment funds, strong, prosperous. We need capitals to invest in AI and in decarbonation. We need our universities, our research centers to attract the best researchers and academics. And we need strong military power. We need autonomous defense with better technology, better equipment. Middle power should neither be alone or weak. As we said, we have to accept that sometimes force needs to be employed. Last point, our businesses are key role to play in the rearmament of the European continent. We managers, we have to clearly get to it, leaders, governors, shareholders, subcontractors. I think we have to have a general mobilization in companies so that each and everyone should be aware of the fact that the superpower, middle power dialectic is not in our favor. So our companies should anticipate, should know the world. Business managers should know more than just status of a business manager, to be players of globalization, and should not leave it to the government and the state. I think this is a challenge. If we don't do rearmament with solid companies, with technologies well controlled, and if we don't have the leaders who can go into power struggles, well, we will not rearm a continent with incantations. Europe will not be a coalition of middle power, but just an open market, open to predators.
My inability to speak French. I should also note that this is the first time I've ever spoken to an audience with headphones on. So I don't know how this is going to go.
You can take your headphones out when you talk. If someone talk, maybe you will use it.
That's so much better. Okay, so as an economist, let me tackle this question from the point of view of international economic engagements. There is a nascent field called geoeconomics, which is actually examining some of these issues, and different people do different things. The bit of the literature that I'm engaged with measures international geopolitical distance on the basis of voting patterns at the United Nations. So there's a trio of political scientists at Georgetown University who put together a database which looks at UN voting patterns and calculates the bilateral geopolitical distance between any two countries at any given point in time. It's a very rich data set because it's got time variance as well as 183 countries. So in some sense, it's much more granular than dividing the blocks into, say, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, or the China bloc and the Western bloc. This is something which is what economists call... You can't hear me?
No, it's the guy
okay. Okay, so that's the fundamental essence of what these geoeconomists are doing. And there's a bunch of economic researchers who have found that all kinds of bilateral economic engagement fall with geopolitical distance. That is true of trade, that is true of foreign direct investment, it's true of portfolio investment, it's true of cross-border banking flows. They all fall dramatically with geopolitical distance, which actually turns out to be more important than geographical distance and has been rising in importance at a faster rate than geographical distance. So this phenomenon has been called geoeconomic fragmentation. And there are many scholars who have kind of modeled what would happen if there was a complete decoupling of the world economy, and they have found that the consequences would be very severe. You could have a hit of 7 to 12% of GDP, depending on the details of the decoupling, whether it was restricted to trade, whether it also included technology transfers, investment, and became a broader phenomenon. So clearly, it's something to be extremely worried about. Now, my own recent work has focused on the idea of connector countries. And this, again, is a complicated issue, but the particular kind of connector country I'm looking at would be called diversification in financial theory. So if you're a well-diversified investor, the essence of a good portfolio is to have lots of assets which are relatively uncorrelated with each other. So if one asset fails, you've still got a lot of other assets to fall back on. A similar principle applies to diversification across the geopolitical spectrum. The idea is that a well-diversified country trades with everyone across the geopolitical spectrum. In some sense, it's quite different from a coalition. This is about diversification, about risk management, and so, for the quantitatively inclined, the relevant metric is the variance of your trade-weighted geopolitical distance from all your trade partners. And when you do that calculation, you find that my country, India, is actually in the top quartile of diversified countries. To give you a flavor of which other countries there are, there's a lot of Asian countries in there. Countries like Vietnam and Cambodia are among the most diversified countries in the world. They are open to all comers, as it were. So this is essentially the work that I've done, and I'm happy to expand on it, and I'm happy to explain the virtues of it. You can put it into a classical, what's called an Armington trade model. So in a typical trade model, you have something called iceberg costs. And iceberg costs are a way of modeling how far away you are geographically, because icebergs melt as you travel long distances. But what you can do in a clever kind of way is substitute iceberg costs with geopolitical distance. And when you do that and you develop a trade model, one thing that drops out of that as a sort of virtue or something that is highly desirable is exactly the kind of diversification index that I've talked about. So if you ask me for my prescription on what middle powers should do, the answer is simple. Be like a well-diversified investor, trade with everybody, invest with everybody, try not to exclude anybody, and when you're signing bilateral free trade deals, be very careful that a bilateral free trade deal with one particular country does not seek to tie your hands or your freedom of action with third countries. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Donc, on voit, c'est très intéressant.
This is most interesting, these two presentations, because they're business focused, and it is quite common that and they're often below radars from public authorities and from the domestic policies, especially the European vision. We should trade with people who have share only our values. You see, the Asian vision is more pragmatic, different. We trade with everybody, doesn't matter. We don't deal with the internal in domestic policy. It's another doctrine. I'm not saying the equivalent, but it's another doctrine. And companies, of course, do business because that's what they do, and therefore it makes it possible, in my opinion, to involve countries or to involve countries in a way which is difficult to stop afterwards. For example, if you want to stop the war in Iran, there is an economic reason. It could be a vector for peace. Montesquieu wasn't totally wrong. So thank you, Sheka, for your declaration. I will now give the floor to Douglas, who will give us a more political vision of how we can build the middle powers with this vision above. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Washington, D.C. based, but I lived in Europe for almost 20 years. So I'm very pleased to be back here. But I must say, after 2 days, I'm a little troubled by the dichotomy between the U.S., where I have to tell you the narrative is about two things. It's always about Trump. We'll get to that. But it's about AI. It's about AI every minute of every day on every topic. And it has been blissfully pleasant for the past several days to be here in France at this conference, where AI has been an ancillary topic. It has not been ignored, but it is not the only thing that we are discussing. So I start with that because framing the world through an AI-dominated prism changes the way we're going to discuss everything. Middle powers and everything else on the agenda for this event. If we take that aside and say it's one of many, many different issues, which is what this event has been so far, that's great. But I just want to say, for me, that's a blissfully, it's a relief to not be focused on both the opportunities and the threats posed by AI, which is really all we are doing in the US. Now, I also want to start by saying I'm not a particular supporter of the current president of the United States. My background as an American here, I feel I have to establish where I am on the spectrum here. I served in the Obama administration. I was an early supporter of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. And I have to tell you that this is not the era of multilateralism of the Obama era. This is an era where the direction of travel is towards a world in which money, power, and technology are increasingly dominant. And in Donald Trump's worldview, might makes right and divide and conquer are the only things that matter, and they are the threats to new economic models, to old economic models, to political allegiances and alliances, and that's separate from the threats and opportunities posed to humanity by AI. And I say to humanity, not because I'm trying to be a dire existentialist here, but because actually the closer you get to AI, the more scary it actually is in terms of what it can and is likely to do to upending existing models. But we are living in Donald Trump's mindset from the US perspective, at least, and this is a panel on US and China as the superpowers and middle powers and what they can and should be able to do in response. We're living in an era of escalation, dominance, and world power, which is dominated by the US and China. I heard a speaker yesterday talk about the EU's enormous power of its collective trading bloc. That's true. But I also heard this morning one of the speakers acknowledge that the Turnberry Trade Accord between the EU and the US represented an abject capitulation by Europe to US pressure. So it is one thing to say Europe has a collective trading bloc that should be a power on par with the US or China. It is another to see whether it is manifesting itself in action. So middle powers collectively have the ability to join together and to resist this directional narrative. The EU reflects the best effort the world has ever seen at middle power cohesion, institutions, and governance, but it lacks sufficient strategic power and effective governance to get almost anything done. Now, the BRICS are almost the opposite. They reflect enormous middle power ambition, but they lack cohesion, they lack a governance structure, they have a collective aversion to the US-led status quo, but that is not the same as a shared strategic project and creating the tools to achieve it. So the lessons from both the BRICS and the EU are the same. Existing middle power structures do not yet present a real challenge to the superpower heft of the United States and China. It is hard to get countries that have been rivals for generations, for centuries, to make the compromises necessary to act with a strategically cohesive voice. Now, that is particularly troubling in two areas, AI and finance. And those are the areas that middle powers are at greatest risk, because AI requires speed. Living in Washington, picking up the newspaper every day, it is extraordinary to see where we were 6 weeks ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, relative to where we are now and where we're going in AI and technology. It is moving fast. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine in December urging Europe to act because they were in an era of crisis. And that was 6 months ago. The crisis is much more accelerated than it was when I wrote the piece. In finance, the EU, I say this everywhere I go. Whenever I give a talk in Europe, I have to say this. The IMF wrote a paper in 2023 pointing out that the EU, the Eurozone, could raise 15% of Eurozone GDP through a collective Euro bond issuance without any aggregate increase in cost. 15% of Eurozone GDP is roughly $3 trillion. Now, when you hear at all the panels about all of the cost-benefit sacrifices everybody's being asked to make in France, in Europe, everywhere, imagine what you could do with 3 trillion euros of costless capital. And when I say costless, what I mean is it does not raise the borrowing costs of any other country in the aggregate for doing so. But we know that there are countries in Europe that refuse to actually agree to a common borrowing instrument. But I'm using that as an example because whether it's AI or finance, the two areas I'm focused on, the ability to step up and actually challenge the existing status quo led by the US and China is there. The question is there a collective will to do so? And unfortunately, to date, I'm not seeing the crisis being reflected in actual action.
Thank you so much. So, benefit if we are able to, pardon.
There are major benefits if Europe should Europe become more coordinated, but we don't have the solutions for the time being. Businesses are there, they do their business, they do their job. Europe, many obstacles, many gains, many obstacles. I will now give the floor to Maria, who will propose solutions, because daily action with the Club de Madrid. Club de Madrid. Not the Club d'Europe, the Club de Madrid. So sorry, I went to Italy recently. I visited Italy recently, that's why. So, and therefore, and she will propose solutions because for the time being, it's a bit sad what we're hearing. We should have a bit of hope. How can we get a bit of hope? And of course, you can speak English if you wish.
Sorry, thank you very much. I will speak in English because it's easier. So bear with me. And Carlos, I'm sorry, but they always confuse. But chime in, please, because that will be good. Some of them have many solutions, and that's what they've been all about. But I think it's important to step back a little bit and think of the fact that the whole concept of middle power is not new. We hear a lot about it, and we've heard a lot about it in recent months because of Mark Carney's speech in Davos. But it is nothing new conceptually, and it was used. There was reference to it during the Cold War quite a bit because in the Cold War we had bipolar confrontations, precisely between the U.S. and Russia and their relations. But in that period of time, post-World War, but in the Cold War, there were countries like Canada or Sweden or the Netherlands who were able to exercise certain influence, who were able to move the needle in certain areas. But gradually, we saw unipolarity and the rise of the U.S. as a unipolar power, and then around 2008, started to lose some of that power, and unipolarity moved again into more of a broader situation. No, more. I wouldn't say multipolar as we have or we're discussing today, but yes, more of a triangular where we had increasingly this tree. There's a China, U.S., China, Russia situation, but all of this is not only because of the crises, the succeeding crises, be it the financial crisis, then COVID, then the Russia-Ukraine war, but also because the U.S. seemed to want to step back and not, and there was decreasing, it seemed, decreasing political will to continue being the sole guarantor of a number of issues, of areas, including peace, including trade, including a number of different areas. Now, with Carney's speech at Davos, I think we see that he takes this idea of middle powers one step forward. When he said that the old order isn't coming back, when he seemed to be so definitive, and so in many ways also defensive. It was more of a let's be clear, let's take guard because this is this situation is not going to change. I mean, we went from talking a few years back about this Thucydides trap and the fact that there was changes, there was change coming, but the new power, the old power was stepping down or moving backwards, and the new power wasn't just yet there. But we see in the case of Carney's statements in Davos that he was, much more on the defensive, saying, we've got to protect ourselves, we've got to, and in that sense, he pointed not only to Canada but to other middle powers, and it was also this going back to a reference or thoughts of variable geometries where there were flexible alliances, more flexible associations, if you wish, or coalitions based on shared interest. And this goes a bit to the connectors that Shekhar was talking about. But one thing that Carney did not do, I mean, he raised the issue, he raised the problem, but one thing that he did not do is to say how. How are these coalitions to be formed, to be built, and central tension that exists? Because on the one hand, the whole proposition is defensive, as I was saying earlier, but on the other hand, it has to, in order for it to happen, it has to be constructive, and we see that there are moves. We see that there are, in the case of Europe, there is an increase in agreements with Mercosur, agreements with India, agreements with Indonesia, and a lot of it, as Ariel said at the beginning, is happening around trade. Trade seems to be the connector or the space within which these alliances and these coalitions can increasingly take place. But there is this tension that I think is important to keep in mind as to are we talking about the defensive, the protection of sovereignty? Are we talking about the cooperation where trying to find alliances that allow for cooperation when the great powers or the superpowers are not willing to cooperate, but rather are in confrontation when we look at it from a more constructive perspective, then it's that possibility that many, and including Carney, I think, see in redesigning the international rules and the governance and the architecture. And so all of this is what we're seeing. As far as the coalitions are concerned, we see a space for coalitions, we see a space for alliances, but it's not only a matter of political will or of saying, yes, we want to work together, we want to cooperate. It's also a matter of having the institutional capacity and the governance capacity to do so. And that is lacking. And so in that sense, we have to look at the possibilities of coalescing from the two perspectives, both the political will, but also from the actual capacity that may exist in doing so.
Thank you very much for that. And last but not least, pardon, alors, ça y est, je reviens au français. Pardon, donc Charles.
Charles, now we'll talk about the G2. Back to that. We go round this couple, the US-China couple. So how can we overcome this and avoid becoming vassals? Back to French, even though I've been living in Washington for quite a while. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk with Doug. I'm the last speaker, hence I will just tell you what I don't agree with from the speakers, and then I'll shut up so that we could have a real discussion. G2. Well, I wanted to talk about it because G2 is something Trump wanted. Trump loves to be invited to Beijing, to be received in the Forbidden City, red carpet, or the anti-decorum, He loves the Arc of Triumph as well. But, he loves his relationship with China because it's very simple. It's basic. It says, I can trade with China, I can have deals with China, and it's an easy way to find solutions and eventually to reassure himself about his own power. What happened in the last 18 months is that China has demonstrated to the US that it has margin of maneuvers versus the US. The US still have a lot, but less than China. China now has imposed the end of trade war by prohibiting the US from importing some technologies which are necessary to the production lines, especially in the automotive industry. So China dictates the pace. So talking about the G2 is reassuring for Trump to say, we can negotiate and discuss difficult issues. It's even more difficult for the US to compare themselves with the Chinese, especially when topic we discussed today. Now, for those who will come after Trump, I fear that the Chinese-American relationship will be worse because Trump loves this relationship because he loves being received in Beijing, but his successors will see the rivalry with China as a priority. So there will be a degradation in all scenarios, be it Democrat or Republican. Things will get bad. Not reassuring for Europe. Your transatlantic is more transactional, which means that they should, we become vassals anyway. But to pull out of this, there are margins of maneuver. Colleagues talked about it, the union of capital markets, to go further in innovation. The variable that is missing is growth. There is a European regulation which still has a weight. Dale was saying, the legislative process in the US is so dysfunctional that it cannot issue a law to govern AI, finance, or, the private data management. So Europe has this leverage. Europe is able to do regulation, but it's not sufficient. Until 5 years ago, it could be reassured by saying, okay, we've adopted, the large GPT, and the US had to adopt it because they could not do without a market. Now it's different. There's an iPhone which is compatible with European regulation, and the other one is not. So if Europe cannot longer be a player in this, because there are lack of growth and a lack of innovation. To compensate for that, well, we've talked about solutions, but I fear, because soon we'll be enter the electoral period, that this message has not yet come true in your growth is a major condition to be a key player. So just a couple of points necessarily of disagreement, but for different views. Carney. Well, I did listen to his speech in Davos, which was brave enough to face, Trump. All these speeches in Davos were not necessarily showing much bravery, but Carney was. However, there was a slight incoherence. At the beginning of the speech, he said, "We knew." It was very hypocritical. We know that. Western order or Occidental world benefited us, but not everybody else. So and then he said, let's rebuild it amongst middle countries. This is something slightly incoherent, but it was a brave, bold speech. We can talk about the hypocrisy of the West. I know that the European Union has signed agreement with Mercosur and India. In France, where people are not quite happy about it, but and sometimes to be jealous in some of the world, part of the world. But the imposition of values in the world is perceived as kind of it's a bit, the carbon footprint for food, as a sign of a very hypocritical action. So, last point, this is something I wanted to add. My Indian colleague talked about it. India as a transition country to compensate the Chinese domination. Unfortunately, in such an unpredictable world as today, the US wanted to move the co-production to India, but the next day they imposed tariffs to India because they said they bought too much oil. Whereas the previous administration said buy oil from Russia, and Trump doesn't want to criticize Russia, but he criticized India and imposed custom rights. So, politics is unpredictable to our custom duties. So so things are too complicated, so not too emotional. So it's going to be tricky. So we haven't solved the problems of middle powers. Fair enough. Let's face it. Trade is okay. It's holding. Businesses can trade. They do business. There are countries and mainly nations or businesses who are intermediates or connectors. This is why trade continues. But politics is not a solution or not an obvious one or not an easy one. This is what I get from this discussion so far. Now, I would like to give the floor to the audience. This is the purpose. It's a more friendly, round-the-table discussion. So please make sure that you speak in the microphone. Yes, I need a microphone. Thank you. You said that politics doesn't work for middle powers, doesn't work, but trade works. But question. It's not easy to do industrial cooperation between France and Germany. We've seen that. There is no European company. We have waited decades to get the status. So this coalition, I've asked the question early on before coming here to Jean-Noël Barrot. He said, oh, it's not very well. Everybody wants an alliance, but middle powers and middle alliance. Those are political slogans. It's not sufficient. So now, could one of you mention an example of industrial alliance between a Canadian, French, German, Indian company in the domain of rare earths, critical materials? Look at the CMA CGM, the manager was there. It just bought logistics in the US, 2.5 billion. He bought in the US, not in Canada. Well, of course, he has a container ship in India built, but they all work on cost and opportunity. So what is the content, economic content, raw material, everything that could be labeled middle power to avoid the China-US hegemony? So do you have any knowledge of a project in progress, or is it possible? Who would like to take this? I'll share your views. Examples we can mention of cooperation between middle powers at the European level, don't concern the topics you mentioned, but nevertheless, we do have a few. Airbus, for example, in aeronautics, was the splendid example of cooperation between different countries, not just France and Germany, by the way, Spain, and it does work. And you know, there was an amazing. This is now a global company which is Boeing's rival. So in the domain of missiles, you know, MBDA. Earlier on, I could see at the end of the morning the CEO was there, and you know, this is also a European cooperation business, including with the British, and which shows that. In that respect, we can be as good as the largest corporations in a given domain. But those two examples are the trees that are hiding the forest, you know. Are they, and in fact, we would like to have many more, but at the same time, we can see that always in aeronautics, you know, a European plane doesn't work, fighter plane doesn't work among European nations. In the spatial domain, it's very complicated to have technologies we clearly need to have European cooperation. So you talked about the rare earths, critical materials. Well, clearly a lot of things need to be done. A lot of things need to be done, and this is a huge field. What strikes me is that we have a feeling that European Union, European Commission, and many European commissioners are now aware of that. And for a couple of years now, they're trying to do smart things. You know, I don't know if Thierry Breton is there, but he was a major European commissioner, and he said very strong things. And he initiated strong projects, especially in space. Though there are several funding or financing mechanisms which are being mobilized in Europe to be able to invest in AI, in the quantum computing space, so that now you know small companies could be companies would have no problem to then finance their growth and become global leaders. So whereas until now, you know, it is when you had problems and difficulties. So we're good in Europe to invent. We're good in Europe to do research. We got major research labs. We got amazing training schools, amazing startups, and then at one stage we finance them. And then when we have to scale up to the next step and find for hundreds of millions of euros, we got capital markets and savings that does not work. So it's a shame because we do have a lot of assets. But let me remind you, the capability of savings in the US is about 700 billion euros per year of dollars. So it's almost the double in the, you know, we got the double of savings available in Europe every year, you know, than in the US. But our savings don't go where they should go. Research in Europe is a success, you know. We got the NRC funds, you know, and let's not be too pessimistic. We do have assets, and of course we can have after that licorns and startups and innovations. An optimistic and pessimistic observation. Optimistic, well, the composition of the CAC 40, you know, the stock exchange group, and companies clearly have global prestige or impact. Not in all countries, you know. Renault doesn't sell in all countries, but it sells in all continents. At the scale of France, I think the country is not doing too badly when it comes to major corporations. There is an issue of financing and dynamism of medium SMEs, but companies are doing better, especially than the Germans, who face problem of competitiveness versus China. This is the most optimistic observation. Now, for the more pessimistic one, the notion of bottleneck. Bottleneck. This is a major issue for middle powers. Chinese and Americans have most of control the most of the bottlenecks. You know, finance, technology, whatever. And I think that we will have to be agile. We'll have to make choices. Maybe, you know, yield. You know, eat the modesty pie. You know, it's not pleasant, but this is what's being done. Sometimes, even when confrontation with China, there will be negotiations that will take place at the custom duties. You know, with Europe and with the US versus China. You know, but anyway. Again, if we look at things clearly, it can be understood. So, you know, bottlenecks do exist for medium-sized powers. So middle countries. So we have to find margins of maneuver. Everybody talks about SML, but the fact in the production chain of semiconductors, Europe has a role to play. It's one way to come back to the negotiation table, but we need more of them. Douglas, you want to say something?
Comment on areas that are working, because I don't think there are very many, as you just sort of heard. But I want to give a suggestion, right? We're supposed to make suggestions. So since AI is, in my view, going to be the dominant economic social driver of the future, Japan just announced last week a 1 trillion yen effort with all of its major AI and technology companies working together. And my suggestion is that Europe, Canada, and other middle powers should all jump on board and create this new alternative. It's not going to be Mistral. It's not going to be a homegrown. But if Europe, Canada can join with Japan, which has the technological prowess and the funding, that's where I would put my effort for a middle power effort that could actually work.
Thank you so much. I think there was one question here. Yes.
Oui, merci.
Back to some of the questions mentioned. I understand that we can't win the presidential elections next year with the middle power issues, but maybe we should give hope again to the European peoples, not just but mostly, with visions which have to be coherent with the very of Europe, which was the idea of coming out of history from the top, to endless wars. It's interesting to see that it's being abandoned in Europe. It's like the Greek tragedies, there is a negative prophecy about the future. The protagonist will react to the prophecy because anxiety, he tries to defend himself against the prophecy, and he speeds up the process for the achievement of the dramatic prophecy. I know the phrase, if you want peace, prepare war. I mean, this was, that was very successful phrase, but it's the phrase of an empire, an expansion empire, who, wanted to lead through war. Now, if we are in the European project, we should say, if you want peace, prepare peace. However, what is very different, and we have to look at the world as it is. This is the aggiornamento as it is, and the world we fight is very different from the world 30, 40 years, 50 years ago. It is control from the West, and the West has lost control over the world, and we have to accept it. The Carnes project is very ambiguous in a way. Is it a reconstruction of the Western Alliance, or is it going elsewhere beyond that? Because what Canada government is doing, immediately after the discourse, they intensified the relationship with China. So my question is, don't you think there is opportunity here to pull out our framework? We don't have any sort of Western moral superiority, and most of the world doesn't want to be like us. So let's accept this reality and let's go beyond the trade relationship, as you said, that function, and then we cannot build a world, pluri-universal, but in the universal of states and nations. Thank you. We got to move just a couple of minutes. Who would like to give a word of conclusion?
So, I'm hearing a lot of questions again about coalitions and what coalitions should be formed. But I would urge a rethinking of the word coalition, because any coalition by definition is exclusive. It treats people within different from people without. And in terms of something that Europe could do, one thing I would advise is openness to foreign direct investment from countries like China. China today is the global leader in green technology. It's got something like a 30 to 40% cost advantage over Europe and all other countries. People, often Western countries, complain that the way that China developed was by ripping off Western companies which came and invested in China. which begs the question of why Europe doesn't think it's a wise idea to do the same. Open up to foreign direct investment, get the best technology from the rest of the world, and try to learn from it and come up to the frontier. This may be a humbling experience for a continent that has sort of always been at the frontier, but it no longer is. So I think it's time to have some humility and accept that there won't always be coalitions in which Europe will be sort of riding on top, but rather a general openness to the rest of the world is something that would benefit the entire world.
One last word.
Oui, juste un mot. I mean, you're opening a major discussion. We would need time for that. But what I'm saying is this: you said the rest of the world doesn't want to be European or to get closer to us or to accept our system. Well, we don't want to be Americans, by the way, and the rest of the world doesn't want to be American or Chinese. So all I'm saying is that we, in Europe, all the economic players we are, all the citizens we are, we are aware of the fact that if we want to exist in international competition versus the superpower, and resist, we need more Europe and a more integrated market, more international cooperation, and more licorns and success and capital markets. We have to be more European than we are today, and the presidential election will be based on this. Let's not discuss the presidential election. Sorry. More Europe, we all agree with that, so I fully agree with that. I vote for more Europe. Thank you all. Thank you to members of the panel, most interesting, maybe to the audience.